Somewhere in Europe, in the last year of the war, a German artillery battery received important visitors. An inspection team had come up from higher headquarters to watch the crews perform. The gunners prepared a demonstration barrage. They loaded. They aimed. They fired. A proud display for the visiting officers. Minutes later, most of them were dead. American shells came down on that exact position, not near it. On it. They killed the inspection team and most of the cannoneers where they stood. We know this happened because a civilian witnessed it, and the account survived in American unit records. The position of that German battery had been fixed by a unit almost no one has ever heard of. Its name was the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Germans fired a demonstration. The Americans treated it as a confession. Think about what that means. Those German guns were miles behind the front line. No American soldier could see them. No airplane photographed them in the act. They were invisible in every way that had mattered for the entire history of warfare. And yet, the moment they spoke, someone on the other side wrote down their address. That is the story of this video, not a story about bigger guns. The Germans had bigger guns, not a story about braver crews. German gunners were among the most professional in the world. This is the story of a web of ears, eyes, and mathematics that changed the basic arithmetic of survival for every artilleryman who fought against the United States Army. A web that turned the act of firing a cannon into an act of self-betrayal. By the summer of 1944, German batteries facing American forces had settled into a strange, defeated rhythm. American observers documented it across every theater. Stay silent while the little American planes were overhead. Fire a handful of rounds at dawn or dusk, then move fast before the answer arrived. Fire once, and run. A gun that behaves that way has already lost. And here is the uncomfortable truth hiding inside that sentence. You do not have to destroy an enemy's artillery to defeat it. You only have to make firing it irrational. How do you do that? How do you find a gun you cannot see, hidden behind a ridge 6 miles away, in the darkened fog, and find it fast enough to kill it before it moves? To answer that, we have to go back almost 30 years. To a Nobel Prize winner sitting on a hill in Belgium, listening to a toilet. Here is a problem that looks unsolvable. Around the turn of the 20th century, artillery learnt a trick called indirect fire. Instead of pointing a cannon at something you could see, you hid it behind a hill. You calculated angles. You dropped shells on targets miles away. The gun became invisible, and almost nobody in any army stopped to ask the obvious next question. If my guns are invisible, how will I ever find his? By 1915, that question was killing men by the tens of thousands. The Western Front had frozen into trenches, and hidden batteries on both sides hammered positions they would never see with their own eyes. You could not silence what you could not locate. Armies tried balloons. They tried kites. They tried timing the interval between a distant flash and the arriving rumble with stopwatches, the way a child counts seconds between lightning and thunder. It was all hopelessly imprecise. A stopwatch and a rumble could tell you a battery existed somewhere inside a patch of countryside the size of a small town. You cannot shoot at a patch of countryside the size of a small town and expect to hit 6 guns inside it. Then a 25-year-old physicist named William Lawrence Bragg was posted to a hill called Mont Kemmel, near Ypres. Bragg was no ordinary lieutenant. He was slim, quiet, with the kind of mind that noticed small things. He had come out of Cambridge, trained in crystallography, in the geometry of atoms. His father was a physicist. His mother was long dead. And in the autumn of that same year, in the middle of this very work, word arrived from Stockholm. William Lawrence Bragg had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. He shared it with his father. He was 25 years old, the youngest laureate the prize had ever crowned. The medal itself would not reach his hands for years, because the ceremony was postponed by the war. The news simply came, and Bragg went back to his instruments. On that hill, wrestling with the problem of locating German guns, he noticed something almost absurd. His billet had a toilet, a rarity on the Western Front, and when heavy German guns fired in the distance, he could feel a pressure change in that small room. 2 separate disturbances, he realized. The sharp, audible crack of the shell tearing through the air. And beneath it, something else. A deep, sub-audible pressure wave rolling out from the gun's muzzle itself. The gun wave. Too low for the human ear, but not too low for the right instrument. Stop for a moment and appreciate what Bragg had found, because everything in this story grows from it. Every cannon that fires produces a physical signature it cannot suppress, cannot camouflage, cannot take back. Sound. A wave expanding outward at a known speed, in all directions. If you plant a line of microphones across the landscape and record down to fractions of a second, the moment that wave touches each one, geometry does the rest. The wave reaches the nearest microphone first, the farthest last, and those tiny time differences trace back to a single point of origin. The gun tells you where it is. The gun cannot help telling you where it is. Camouflage nets defeat the eye. Distance defeats the eye. Darkness and fog defeat the eye. None of them defeat a pressure wave. By 1918, sound ranging had matured with astonishing speed, and the young American Expeditionary Force, arriving late to the war, embraced it. During the fighting at Saint-Mihiel in September of that year, one American sound ranging unit located 117 German gun positions in a single 24-hour period. 117 invisible batteries, plotted from their own muzzle blasts, in a day. The confession machine worked. And then the war ended. And here is where the story takes the turn that decided everything. 2 decades later, most armies filed sound ranging away as a curiosity of trench warfare. Clever, fiddly, irrelevant to the fast, mobile wars of the future. Britain shelved it. France shelved it. Germany, defeated and disarmed, had no chance to develop it further. The instruments went into storage. The men who had built the technique went back to their laboratories and their farms. The United States Army, of all institutions, did not shelve it. Through the poverty of the interwar years, when Congress cut the army to a skeleton and generals fought over the last scraps of the budget, a small handful of officers at Fort Sill, Oklahoma refused to let the technique die. They kept the microphones. They kept the recording sets. They kept refining the mathematics. They were not visionaries. They were not celebrated. They were middle-ranking men in a forgotten branch of a shrunken army. What they did quietly, in classrooms and on scrub prairie, with old equipment and no publicity, and they built dedicated units around it. Field artillery observation battalions, whose entire purpose was to find enemy guns by sound and by the flash of their muzzles at night, and to feed those locations to the heaviest guns America had. By the end of the Second World War, there would be 25 of these battalions, 13,000 men. They would take part in nearly every battle the army fought from late 1942 onward, from the sands of Tunisia to the forests of the Ardennes to the ash of the German heartland. 13,000 men, and history has almost no idea they existed. When a general reviewed one of these battalions during stateside maneuvers, he had to have the unit's identification repeated to him. He did not know what a field artillery observation battalion was. He was reviewing it. There is something quietly profound in the choice to keep the ears alive. Armies, like people, tend to remember dramatic lessons and forget subtle ones. Tanks and dive bombers were dramatic. A microphone in the mud was subtle. For 20 years, the subtle lesson survived on almost no money, in a handful of classrooms and field exercises, waiting for the question they answered to be asked again at full volume. The question was asked in Tunisia, in the winter of 1943. The Germans were still the finest artillerymen in the world. Their doctrine was called Truppenführung, and it treated the gun as a weapon of movement, of concentration, of precise professional judgment. Every German battery commander had been trained in a tradition that ran back through the First World War, back through the Franco-Prussian War, back to Frederick the Great himself. When German gunners loaded a shell and pulled the lanyard, they did it with the confidence of men who had been the masters of their craft for 200 years, and they had good reason for that confidence. In Poland, in France, in the Balkans, in Russia, their guns had done exactly what guns had always done. They had fired. They had killed. They had displaced. And no one on the other side had ever plotted their exact address from the sound of a single round. They had not yet met the American system. They did not know it existed. They did not know that in the sand and rock of North Africa, a young lieutenant with a surveyor's transit was already crawling ahead of the American infantry, laying an invisible mathematical grid across the desert. They did not know that, in a tent behind the lines, men were unspooling a strip of film and waiting for a stylus to twitch. They did not know that, in a few short weeks, one of their own field marshals, the most famous soldier in Germany, would sit down and write a letter to his wife about something the Americans were doing that had unsettled him. They did not know that firing a cannon was about to become the most dangerous thing an artilleryman could do, because the ears were listening now, and the eyes were being built, and the nervous system that would bind them together into a single mind was already reaching out across the ocean, waiting for its first customer. The first customer would be Erwin Rommel. Picture the anatomy of the thing, because it deserves to be seen whole. Miles behind the American front line, the guns, the 155mm long toms and the 8-inch pieces of the Corps' artillery, long-barreled, deep-throated, patient, the executioners. At the front and beyond it, the sensors, a sound-ranging base, a carefully surveyed line of microphones stretching across miles of terrain, wired back to a recording set that scratched the arrival of every pressure wave onto moving film, timed to hundredths of a second, flash-ranging posts on high ground, where men with optical instruments waited through the night for the orange blink of a muzzle miles away. 2 posts, seeing the same blink from different angles, gave intersecting lines. Intersecting lines gave a point on a map, and binding it all together, the invention America had quietly perfected at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The Fire Direction Center, a single hub that could take a set of coordinates and turn them into synchronized fire from every battery in range. There was one more ingredient. Invisible. Absolutely decisive. Survey. All those microphones, all those flash posts, all those gun batteries, they had to exist on one unified mathematical grid. Their positions known to within a few yards, or the geometry collapsed. Someone had to carry that grid forward, stake by stake, often ahead of everything else. The men who carried it were not glamorous soldiers. They were trained engineers with tripods and transits, working in the desert wind, in the Italian mud, in the Belgian snow. They were the surveyors of the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion. At El Guettar, in Tunisia, in March of 1943, one of those surveyors went out in advance of the American infantry, to establish survey control for the artillery that was being brought up for the attack. He finished the job 2 days before the guns even arrived. He worked under German shell fire. The citation that later accompanied his Legion of Merit described his conduct with the phrase, "complete disregard for his own safety." A month later, he was setting up instruments at a forward flash ranging post, again under fire, when he spotted a German battery below him. He was a surveyor, not a gunner. It did not matter. He got on the radio to the Corps Fire Direction Center. He called for fire like a man who had done it all his life. And he neutralized not just that battery, but others. A battalion's worth of German artillery, silenced by a man whose job description said measure things. His name did not become famous. Neither did the names of the other men in his unit. They did the war's most important mathematics in almost total anonymity. Their battalion commander took the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion from North Africa through 5 major campaigns. Through Sicily, through Italy, through southern France, through Germany itself. And when the war ended, hardly a newspaper in America knew the battalion's name. Now, why does Tunisia matter so much? Because Tunisia is where the Germans got their first taste, and because of who reported it. On the 18th of February, 1943, only days after mauling green American troops at Kasserine Pass in one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States Army, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat down and wrote a letter to his wife. Rommel was 51 years old. He was already the most famous general in Germany and one of the most famous in the world. He had beaten the British across the desert. He had made Winston Churchill mutter his name in the House of Commons. He had every reason, that week, to feel triumphant. Read what he wrote. An observation plane directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets. Read it again. In the middle of an American defeat. In the middle of American chaos. The thing the Desert Fox found worth writing home about, the thing that had crawled under his skin, was the eerie efficiency of American fire direction. The infantry had broken. The machinery had not. And the machinery was about to get much, much better. Because every piece fed every other piece, the microphones heard a battery and gave the fire direction center a fix. The flash posts confirmed it at night. The surveyed grid meant the fix was real, not approximate. And the fire direction center could mass a dozen, 2 dozen, 50 guns onto that single point, often placing the first American shells on a German position within minutes of its first shot, not ranging shots, walking closer while the German crews scrambled for cover. A verdict, delivered all at once. Put yourself inside a German gun pit as the American method matures through 1943 and into Italy. You fire a mission. Somewhere out there, a stylus twitches on a strip of film. Men you will never see lay a ruler across a map. And you have what? 5 minutes. 8 before the countryside around your gun erupts. You start to learn a new instinct, one no artillery manual ever taught. The instinct that your own muzzle blast is the enemy's best spy. In the artillery duels of the Mediterranean War, duels the Germans kept losing, that instinct hardened into doctrine. Fire briefly, displace immediately, or better, do not fire at all. But the microphones had weaknesses, and the Germans knew them. Heavy friendly fire could drown a sound base in noise. Bad terrain could bend the readings. And a location fixed in minutes was still a location minutes old. What the whole arrangement still lacked was an eye that never blinked. Something hanging over the battlefield all day, every day, watching for the flash, correcting the shells in real time. The army found it in the most humiliating place imaginable. A 65 horsepower civilian toy that a family sedan could outrun. The Germans would come to dread it more than any bomber in the sky. Before the war, the Piper Cub was a joke with wings. A fabric-covered puddle jumper that cruised at 75 miles per hour and stalled at 38. Sold to weekend flyers for just over $1,000. The Army Air Corps wanted nothing to do with it. The generals were dreaming of bombers. So the light plane manufacturers pulled one of the great sales moves in military history. They simply gave planes, pilots, and mechanics to the army for free during the 1941 maneuvers, and let the results argue for them. Among the officers who flew in one during those trials was a colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower. The results argued loudly. Painted olive drab, fitted with a radio and an extra window in the roof, the Cub became the L-4, and 2 of them were issued to every American artillery battalion. Now, think about what that little plane actually was. Because its weakness was the disguise of its power. It had no guns, no armor. A rifle bullet in the right place could bring it down. But it could loiter, hang almost motionless over the front lines at 1,000 feet, an unhurried, patient presence, while the observer in the back seat studied the German rear like a man reading a newspaper. And through that radio, the observer was connected to the fire direction center, which meant he was connected to every gun in range. The Cub was not an airplane in any meaningful sense. It was a floating trigger for 100 cannons. One L-4 pilot flew for the 12th Corps Artillery under Patton's Third Army. He had personally flown his Cub the 90 miles across the English Channel to Normandy. He liked to say that given a stiff enough headwind, he could land and take off in 19 inches. School had taught him to stay 200 yards behind the front lines. The war taught him otherwise. When an SS Mountain Division was mauling elements of Third Army and vanishing before anyone could react, the order to find it rolled downhill from corps to course artillery to one man in a fabric airplane. As he recounted it decades later, the instruction from his general amounted to 5 words. Go find the SS guys. And he went. Here is the piece of the puzzle this part exists to deliver. And it is the beating heart of this entire story. American commanders began noticing a pattern. It was documented in theater after theater, in Europe and the Pacific alike. When the spotter planes were up, German batteries simply did not fire. They sat silent, whole regiments of artillery, dug in, supplied, crews standing by, mute. And when they absolutely had to shoot, they compressed their entire day's violence into a few rounds at dawn and a few at dusk. The grey minutes when the light was too poor for observation. And then they went quiet again. Before the answer could find them, in some sectors, these unarmed toys directed up to 95% of all the American artillery fire delivered. But their most profound effect was the fire that never happened at all. Do you see what had occurred? No German gun had been hit yet in this equation. The mere presence of a slow, olive-painted airplane in the sky rewrote the decision facing every German battery commander below. Fire, and the man in the sky sees your flash. And within minutes, your position becomes a coordinate. And the coordinate becomes a concentration. Do not fire, and you survive. But then why do you exist? The Cub did not suppress German artillery with explosives. It suppressed it with consequences. Let me give you one measure of what this meant to the men on the ground, because it is the most human piece of evidence I found. In 1978, 33 years after the war, a former American infantryman finally tracked down a former spotter pilot to write him a letter. On Luzon, in the Philippines, the infantryman had been pinned under enemy shellfire, certain he was going to die, when a spotter plane droned into view overhead. The enemy guns stopped. Just stopped. No shell was fired at them. The silhouette alone was enough. The infantryman spent 3 decades convinced that little plane had saved his life, and he wanted the pilot to know it. Think about that. The suppression cut in strange directions, too. Major Charles Carpenter, 32 years old, a high school history teacher from Illinois before the war, flew an L-4 for the 4th Armored Division. He grew so frustrated with merely watching the enemy that he bolted 6 bazookas to the wing struts of his plane, named her Rosie the Rocketer, and went hunting tanks, in an aircraft made of fabric. But the revealing detail is not Carpenter's audacity. It is the German response. At first, German troops largely held their fire, even at this armed Cub buzzing their columns, because shooting at it meant revealing themselves. And revealing themselves meant everything we have been discussing. Only after his rockets kept finding armor did the word finally go out to fire at light planes on sight. Carpenter told a Stars and Stripes reporter that suddenly they shot at him on every mission. But sit with the original calculus for a moment. Trained soldiers, rifles in hand, an enemy aircraft crawling overhead at 80 miles per hour. And for months, the smarter move was silence. So by the middle of 1944, the picture looks complete. Sound bases that hear the guns by day. Flash posts that see them at night. A surveyed grid that makes every fix real. A plane that makes daylight firing suicidal. A fire direction center that turns any fix into a massed verdict within minutes. German gunners along the entire front learning the same lesson. The only survival was brevity and flight. And yet, history delivered a contrast. Because there was a place where the Germans looked at this entire machine and found a real answer. A place where they held the high ground, outranged everything the Americans had ashore, hid their most fearsome guns inside solid rock, and made a mockery of every microphone and every Cub on the beachhead. For 4 months in 1944 on a strip of Italian coastline, the Americans met a weapon their instruments could not touch. The GIs trapped there gave the weapon a woman's name, and the way the Germans used her tells you more about who was winning this duel than any victory could. Anzio, February 1944. The Allied landing meant to unlock Rome had congealed into a besieged beachhead, and the Germans ringed it with some 370 artillery pieces on high ground, looking down the throats of tens of thousands of men packed onto a flat coastal plain. And from nearly 30 kilometers away, beyond the reach of anything the Allies had ashore, including the Long Toms, came something worse. A 218-ton Krupp K5 railway gun, hurling 550-pound shells that arrived. Survivors said, with the sound of a runaway freight train. The GIS named her Anzio Annie. There were actually 2 of them, Leopold and Robert. And the Americans never figured that out during the battle. Study how the Germans operated those guns, because it is a masterclass. And an admission. Between missions, the K5s hid deep inside a railway tunnel on the Rome line, invulnerable to bombs and shells alike. The crews prepared everything in the dark of the rock. Then the gun rolled out, fired 6 to 8 rounds, each round taking 4 to 7 minutes, and was pushed straight back into the tunnel before retaliation could arrive. The Germans surrounded the real guns with decoys, fake railway guns with telephone poles for barrels, rigged with flash and smoke generators. Their camouflage, deliberately just imperfect enough to be found. Allied fighter bombers hammered the fakes. A French cruiser fired 350 rounds over 3 days at one suspected hideout and damaged, of all things, the kitchen cars. By any local measure, any one, the Army's own history admits the effort spent hunting those guns was out of all proportion to the damage they caused. But now step back and look at what German success actually required in 1944. It required a gun that outranged the entire American inventory, a mountain to hide inside, and an elaborate theater of decoys. And even with all of that, the finest heavy gun crews in the Wehrmacht dared expose themselves for only 6 to 8 rounds, before running back into the rock. The exception did not break the rule. The exception was the rule. Performed with a 218-ton gun, against the American system, even invulnerability behaved like fear. And here is a detail that borders on dark comedy. Other German heavy batteries at Anzio, the long-range 170mm guns, also firing from beyond retaliation range, were crippled by something no one on the beachhead could see. American reports of the period estimated that a very high proportion of their shells, in some cases roughly 70%, were duds. Almost certainly the quiet sabotage of the slave laborers Germany had forced into its munitions plants. Even when German guns could fire safely, Germany itself was failing them. Meanwhile, the American apparatus kept growing new senses. German mortars, small, hidden, quick to move, were slipping through the sound bases. So the Army did something wonderfully American. It took anti-aircraft radars, instruments designed to track planes, and tilted them toward the ground. Sets like the SCR-584 could track a mortar bomb in flight and trace it backward, fixing the firing position to within about 25 yards. Follow the arc of this for a second, like watching evolution on fast forward. Years in 1918, eyes at night, a grid beneath everything, wings over everything. And now, radio waves. Every new sense wired into the same nervous system, all of it converging on the same simple sentence, delivered to German gun crews. We will know. But instruments are operated by men. And in December of 1944, the men paid. When the German offensive erupted through the Ardennes, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion was on the road from Aachen toward the front. Sound and flashmen, kids in their 20s, technicians, the ears of the artillery. They did not know it yet, but their war was about to end at a crossroads outside a small Belgian town called Malmedy. On the 17th of December, 1944, at a crossroads near Baugnes, outside the Belgian town of Malmedy, the convoy of Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion ran head-on into the lead SS Panzer column of the German counter-offensive. The column was commanded by Joachim Peiper, 29 years old, an SS Obersturmbannführer, a man who had already left a trail of burned villages across the Eastern Front, and who was in a great hurry to reach the Meuse before the fuel in his tanks ran out. The Americans in the convoy were lightly armed technicians. They rode in unarmored trucks. Their weapons were the tools of their trade. A stopwatch, a strip of recording film, a pair of optical instruments, a radio. They were captured, disarmed, herded into a snowy field beside the crossroads. Then the SS opened fire on the prisoners with machine guns. 84 American soldiers died there. Some tried to run. Some played dead in the snow and were shot at close range as the SS walked among them. A handful escaped into the woods and lived to testify. History remembers it as the Malmedy Massacre. But almost no one who knows the name remembers who those men were. They were not infantrymen. They were not tankers. They were not the men whose names families put on football fields and post office walls. They were sound and flash technicians. The ears of the American artillery. Men whose weapon was a stopwatch and a strip of film. The SS who killed them almost certainly had no idea what a Field Artillery Observation Battalion even was. Their own generals had not known. Their names are on the memorial at Baugnes today. If you drive out from Malmedy on a grey winter afternoon, you can walk the field. It is still quiet. It is still cold. And the stones stand in the shape of a cross where the men fell. The Bulge was the German army's last great gamble in the West, and its artillery arm entered that battle already broken in spirit, in the way this whole story predicts. The gunners had learned, over 18 months of bitter experience, that firing was dying, and so they fired sparingly, and moved constantly, and hoped for weather that would ground the little planes. But the final, unanswerable proof came in the first months of 1945, on the banks of a river, because when the German army had to run for the Rhine bridges, its guns faced a choice with no third option left: fire to cover the retreat and be found, or stay silent and let the army die. What happened next was the verdict. Winter into spring, 1945. The German defense west of the Rhine collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of men funneled toward the few remaining bridges, under skies the Luftwaffe no longer owned. Somebody had to cover that retreat, and duty fell where it always falls. On the guns, German batteries deployed on the West Bank and did the one thing years of this war had taught them never to do against Americans in daylight. They fired. Sustained. Repeated. Desperate fire. Because a covering force that shoots twice and runs covers nothing. Overhead, the Cubs were waiting. American accounts from that winter described the air observation posts having, in the dry language of the reports, several field days against the German batteries trying to protect the crossings. One after another, the covering guns were located, engaged, destroyed, or silenced. The retreat they were supposed to shield turned into a slaughter at the bridge approaches. For years, German gunners had survived by rationing their courage into a few rounds at first light. The Rhine stripped that option away, forced them to stand and speak. And the moment they spoke at length, the system closed over them like water. That is the causal chain of this entire story compressed into one river crossing. The methods did not merely punish German artillery when it fired. They had spent years teaching it not to fire, and then destroyed it in the one moment when it had no choice. Now open the ledger and ask the question a thoughtful viewer has been holding since the beginning. If the answer was this decisive, why did the Germans not simply build the same thing? They were, after all, superb artillerymen with a longer gunnery tradition than America's. Their own doctrine, the Truppenführung, stated it plainly. Artillery must be used with great mobility to achieve its full effect. They understood the theory perfectly. What they could not do was pay for it. And I mean that in the widest sense. Take the airplane. Germany actually possessed a wonderful spotting aircraft, the Fieseler Storch, arguably a better machine than the Cub. And that was precisely the problem. The Storch was a masterpiece of engineering, therefore expensive, complex, built in numbers far too small to hang one over every division the way the Americans did with their $1,000 puddle jumpers. America issued Cubs the way it issued trucks. Germany husbanded the Storch like jewelry. And even if the Luftwaffe had built 10,000 of them, Allied fighters ruled the sky. A German spotter loitering over American lines in 1944 had a life expectancy measured in minutes. The eye in the sky was a luxury only the side with air supremacy could afford, which meant the entire duel of observation was decided before a single gun fired. Take mobility, the very thing German doctrine demanded. An American heavy artillery battalion, fully motorized, could road march up to 160 miles in a day. The bulk of German artillery moved behind horses, and horse-drawn guns managed perhaps 25 miles a day before the animals broke down. Sit with that contrast. The tactic that American methods forced on German gunners, fire and displace, again and again, was exactly the tactic their horses could not sustain. American pressure demanded that German gunners become nomads, precisely when German logistics condemned them to crawl, and then the guns themselves. General Hans Eberbach, 49 years old, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, recorded that his artillery park contained pieces from every major power in Europe: French guns, Czech guns, Russian guns, captured and pressed into service. A museum masquerading as an army, every caliber demanding its own ammunition, its own firing tables, its own spare parts. And ammunition was the cruelest entry in the ledger. In Normandy, largely because of supply strangulation, Eberbach's guns could fire roughly 10% of what the British opposite him fired. 10%. Before a single microphone or spotter plane entered the calculation, the German gunner was already a poor man in a shooting match against a millionaire. Add American eyes and ears on top of that poverty, and you get the full, suffocating truth. The German artilleryman had almost nothing to shoot, and shooting the little he had would summon a hurricane onto his head. So German batteries fell silent. And here is where this story reaches for its deepest point, the one that outlives the war. We instinctively measure military defeat in wreckage, burnt tanks, cratered gun pits, casualty columns. But the American counter-battery methods won most of their victories without firing at all, by doing something subtler and more absolute too. They changed what it was rational for the enemy to do. Every German battery commander on the Western Front carried a private equation. Value of this fire mission versus probability it kills my battery. And the microphones, the flash posts, the radar, and above all that unhurried little plane, pushed the second half of the equation towards certainty. Fire meant death. Therefore fire became brief. Therefore fire became rare. Therefore the German infantry fought the last year of the war under skies that answered them with steel, while their own guns stood mute in the tree lines behind them. Present, loaded, useless. An army's artillery arm was defeated in the minds of its officers, battery by battery, decision by decision. And most of those defeats left no wreckage at all. Silence was the wreckage. The men who felt this most were not analysts. They were the German commanders trying to hold fronts together. Rommel, watching the Italian campaign, wrote that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, had broken the front open. In Normandy, he reported the great superiority of American artillery and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. The most dangerous German general of the war. Twice, in his own words, pointing at the same thing. And on the other side, George S. Patton, 59 years old, a man not famous for sharing credit, told his men after the fighting that he did not need to explain who had won the war, because they already knew. The artillery did. The historian Michael Doubler would later call the American field artillery the most brilliant performer in the combined arms team of the United States Army. Not the biggest, not the most glamorous, the most brilliant. A word you use for a system, not a gun barrel. And what a strange system to earn that word. Remember what it was actually made of. A Nobel laureate's realization on a hill in Flanders that a cannon's own breath betrays it. Microphones in the mud, wired to film. Surveyors like the men of the 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion, crawling forward of the infantry with transits, building an invisible grid of numbers across North Africa and Europe. Men on cold hilltops logging muzzle flashes through the night, radar sets bent from the sky toward the earth. A history teacher's airplane, 65 horsepower, holding entire artillery regiments hostage by simply existing overhead. None of these things looks like a weapon. Together, they were among the most decisive weapons of the 20th century because they attacked the one thing no gun crew can armor: the consequences of pulling the lanyard. Which brings us back to where we began. That German inspection team, standing beside a battery somewhere in Europe, watching a demonstration barrage. Officers and crews around a gun, doing exactly what it was built to do in any previous war, in any previous decade. That moment was routine. In this war, against this enemy, it was a confession, a fixed coordinate, and a death sentence, separated from each other by only a few minutes of flight time. They never saw what found them. Nobody German ever did. That was the point. And remember the men in the snow at Baunez, the 84 murdered soldiers of Battery B, whose weapons were microphones and stopwatches, whose names appear on the memorial today. The SS who killed them almost certainly had no idea what a field artillery observation battalion even was. Nearly nobody did. Their own generals did not. That anonymity was the price of serving inside a machine whose whole genius was invisibility. The men who made German guns afraid of the dark were men history itself could not see. The 1st Field Artillery Observation Battalion, and the surveyors who had laid its grid across 5 campaigns, walked into occupied Germany in the spring of 1945. They received no parades. Their citations were quiet. They went home to civilian jobs, to family dinners, to lives that no neighbor could have understood. They never got a monument. The final verdict, then, German artillery in the West was not outgunned into defeat, shell for shell, and steel for steel, it remained formidable to the last day. It was outknown. American counterbattery, the ears, the eyes, the grid, the wings, the nervous system binding them into one mind, made every German muzzle flash a signed confession, and every fire mission a gamble with the whole crew's lives on the table. Faced with that arithmetic, brave and professional men did the only rational thing brave and professional men could do. They fired once, and they ran. And an artillery arm that must run from its own shadow has already surrendered, no matter how many guns it still owns. War, in the end, is a contest of systems. But the men inside the systems were not components. They had names. They had families. They had childhoods on farms and in classrooms. The pilots of the L4s, the technicians of the 285th, the surveyors of the 1st, the gunners of the Corps' artillery. 84 names on a memorial at Baugner's, and they deserve to be remembered by them.